Hello, it's Alex, the Bookubus. Today I'm going to be talking about my favourite books that I read in 2021. I read, I believe, a total of 94 books, and the vast majority of them were horror, and I had 5 titles that were 4.5 or 5-star reads for me. So I had a top 5 basically ready to go without even having to think about it. But I read a ton of other really excellent books this year, so I'm going to share my top 5, but I am also going to mention 10 other books that really stuck with me and I would definitely recommend. All but one of them are horror, so otherwise they're in no particular order, but I'll start off with the non-horror one. It is Kink by Kathy Koja. This is about a couple who become a threesome, and it follows the transformation of that relationship and the highest highs and lowest lows that it goes through. And yeah, it's a relationship study basically, and amazingly written, as is all of her work that I've read so far. The Mud Ballad by Jo Quinnell. This was one of the first books I read in 2021 and it really stuck with me. The tone of it, the setting and the characters were all really strong. It's about conjoined twins who are part of a circus, and one of the twins no longer wants to be joined to the twin brother. And so yeah, some stuff happens and it's set in a very muddy town, as you can guess from the title. Yeah, this was just so unique and brilliant. You Know It's True by J.R. Hamantashen. This is a short story collection and there's an array of content here, but most of it's dark in one way or another, and some of them definitely goes to some pretty bleak and soul-crushing places. Some of the stories in here really made me think, and yeah, really made me feel a lot of feelings, and yeah, I just thought it was excellent. The Mirror of Night by Roberta Lanis. This is another short story collection full of dark and disturbing content. She's a very talented writer, but unfortunately I think this book only got a limited release, so it's not widely available, but I'm very glad I tracked a copy down. There are many messed up characters and scenarios in this collection, so highly recommend if that sounds interesting to you. And for something completely different, there had to be a point horror book on here, and my favourite that I read last year was Fatal Secrets by Richie Tankersley Cusick. It's about a teenage girl whose sister died, and there are some secrets surrounding her death that the main character starts to uncover, and in doing so finds herself in potential danger. This one is quintessential point horror. I had a lot of fun with it. It was very entertaining and yeah, ticked all of the 90s YA horror boxes for me. Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. This is a story of modern day Britain and being a trans person within that, and also a haunted house story. It's about dealing with trauma and about dealing with the culture that you live in, and yeah, made for a very unique horror story. Water Shall Refuse Them by Lucy McKnight Hardy. This is set in the 1970s during a heatwave one summer and follows a family who are grieving the death of one of the children, and they take a holiday to Wales as a way to deal with that tragedy. And we're mostly following the teenage daughter, who then meets a local boy and they form a friendship which goes to some dark places. And this one has some folk horror vibes and some really interesting characters. The Wood Witch by Stephen Gregory. This is a tale of obsession and a character who is spending some time again in Wales, funnily enough. I hadn't put them in order, but that was a coincidence. And he decides he wants to cultivate a wood witch, which is a name for a fungus that grows into a very phallic shape, and this becomes an obsession of his, and the process of doing so goes through some gross and disturbing things, and this is a slow burn but ends in a very intense climax. Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. This is about a sociopathic photographer who is also possibly an unreliable narrator, and her attempts to leave her mark on the world in one way or another. And last but not least, Negative Space by B.R. Yeager. A small town, a suicide epidemic, a new hallucinogenic drug that is making the rounds, told from the perspective of a few teenagers within this town. This was a strange one, but I loved it. Definitely had a dark and unsettling, like foreboding tone to it that really stayed with me. So it was really difficult to narrow down my many 4-star reads of the year to just those 10, but all of those were excellent and I would definitely recommend them if they sound interesting to you. And now into my top 5, and the first one isn't adult horror fiction like the rest of them, but it was one of my favourite books of the year. It is the Usborne World of the Unknown book about ghosts, and this is a children's book. It's one that I never actually owned a copy when I was a kid, but I definitely remember flipping through a copy of it in our school library, and the illustrations were ingrained in my mind ever since. And I found that my local library here actually had a copy, so I borrowed it and just had a brilliant nostalgic trip down memory lane. It was really wonderful, such a great reading experience, and definitely one of my favourites of the year because of that. And while of course nostalgia did play a big role in my enjoyment of it, I do think it's a really great book. It's really well written and informative. It's all about ghosts, what's not to love. And I don't think that, even though it's a children's book, it doesn't talk down to the reader. So I think it's wonderful, and the illustrations again are just mind-blowing. So definitely recommend this one. The rest of the top 5 are adult horror fiction, and one of them is Consumed by David Cronenberg. This starts off following a couple who are both journalists, and one of them is investigating a story about an older couple who were famous for being philosophers. The wife is found dead and the husband is the suspect of not only having murdered her but also maybe having eaten parts of her body. And that's just the tip of the iceberg here. There's a lot going on in this book. We have cancer and disease, we've got 3D printing, we've got North Korea and the Cannes Film Festival. What might seem like a very odd combination on paper, but absolutely works. I'm mad at myself for not picking this up sooner. I'm a big fan of David Cronenberg, but I was nervous that this wasn't going to be any good. So yeah, my bad. It was amazing. I really hope he writes more fiction because this one was just absolutely brilliant. Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Brite. This was actually a reread for me. I first read it back in my teenage vampire obsessed years. Loved it then and still loved it today. It's a vampire story and following a teenage boy who doesn't feel like he really belongs where he is with his family, so he sets off on the road to try and discover where he really belongs. And we're following a handful of different characters. The stories then intertwine, and some of these characters are vampires. We have your more traditional type of vampire who is very old and generally plays by the rules of being a vampire. And then we have these younger vampires who are a bit more reckless and yeah, just generally like to party and do crazy stuff. This is definitely one of my favourite vampire novels and just one of my favourite horror novels in general. The writing is beautiful and descriptive and immersive, and yeah, can't say enough good things about it really. The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Yes, this was actually a first time read for me. The film Hellraiser is one of my all-time favourites. I've seen it many times and love it, but for whatever reason had never picked up the book. And yeah, I knew I was going to love it and I did. This is about a character who is obsessed with finding like the next high, the next thrill, and he comes into possession of a puzzle box which ends up summoning something, and the story goes from there. Again, beautifully written, it's gruesome and graphic at times, and yeah, just such a unique story. This is definitely one that has stood the test of time for a very good reason. And number one, my very favourite book of the whole year out of the 94 things I read, is This Symbiotic Fascination by Charlie Jacob. This is going to be the book that I try to push on everyone, just so you know. It's the new The Cipher by Kathy Koja, because I've been rambling on about that for quite a while now and pushing it on everyone I can. And not that I'm ever going to stop doing that, because The Cipher is still amazing. This book also deserves more attention, and yeah, it's just always so cool to find a hidden gem like this, but just also kind of disappointing that you're like, why didn't this get big? You know, why isn't this better known? And this is the first thing by Charlie Jacob I've read. I'm very excited to read more because she's such a talented writer, and this one was such a strange and original story with really interesting characters. It is partly a vampire story, but unlike any other vampire story you will have ever read. And if you're not into vampires, don't let that put you off picking this book up, because it's really only part of the story. And yeah, with it being so unlike other vampire stories, hopefully that wouldn't turn you off. We have a female character who is desperate to connect with someone and have some kind of relationship because she's never had that, and she sees herself as ugly and unlovable, and yeah, is just desperate for some kind of contact. And there's a male character who had a very traumatic upbringing, and he has these like 3 inner demons. He has attacked and raped several women and has gone away with it. And there's another character who is able to shapeshift, and this allows him to do some very messed up things. And yeah, there were just so many interesting characters here, and the storyline was wild and amazing. It's beautifully written, it's very poetic at times, it also gets very graphic and gruesome at times. I thought it was a really awesome mix and really had me hooked. There's also part of the story involving a VHS tape and what people see when they watch it and what happens. I'm not going to say any more about that, but it was just, yeah, so much like amazing, vivid and evocative imagery. It's intense, and yeah, I just loved this one. I read this I think in the summer, and I knew it was going to be a hard one to beat, and yeah, for the rest of the year nothing did beat it. I have read lots of amazing books this year, but this is 100% my number one. So that is it. Those were all of my favourite books that I read in 2021. If you've read any of these, I would love to hear your thoughts on them. If you're thinking about picking any of them up, then I'd love to hear your thoughts when you get to reading them. Do let me know what your favourite reads of 2021 were. I'd be very interested to hear about them. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video.